In the decades following the end of the Civil War, the United States propels itself into the forefront of industrial nations. The country has been developing a manufacturing economy since the early 19th century. But given the devastating crisis it has just been through, this meteoric rise seems nothing short of miraculous.
If one is looking at the great moments of change in the history of the world, the Industrial Revolution is one of those great moments of change. It's equal in its importance to the future of the world as, say, the Agricultural Revolution of 2,000 years earlier. And we generally think of the age of industrialization as the period after the Civil War.
This is an era, actually, in which U.S. industry explodes. We become the top economic power, along with the Germans and certainly the British. But it is economic power that is undergirding our ambitions.
What causes this economic explosion? No single explanation is sufficient. Rather, it is the convergence of a number of dynamic factors, beginning with the availability of resources and human ingenuity.
Individuals who were critical in the creation of the Industrial Revolution, including many nameless people, workers and inventors and people who were lost to history. But some of the great names of the Industrial Revolution are, first of all, the people who built the railroads.
Although the railroads, of course, had begun well before this. The 1860s, the 1880s, 90s is an era in which you see the birth of a truly national economy. Communications networks through the railroad, transport, it's starting to link the country together.
Without railroads, many of the great industries could not have begun, let alone flourish. They couldn't have gotten the raw materials to the factories, they couldn't have gotten their products to the markets. And so some of the great names of the Industrial Revolution are people like the Vanderbilts and James J. Hill, the great railroad tycoons, the Harrimans and others.
The creation and development of machines and of machine tools enables the United States to start to challenge Britain and to some extent Germany and other parts of Northwest Europe as a serious contender as in the sort of league of industrial producers.
We talk about some of the great inventors, the inventors of the Bessemer process, for example, and the open hearth steel processing. Going back earlier, the inventor of the cotton gin helped create the first great industry in the South, the textile industry. Thomas Edison, whose inventions made such a huge contribution to the use of electrical power, which became critical to the economy.
By the early 1890s, the U.S. is, in purely volume terms, producing a greater value of industrial goods than France, Germany, and Britain combined.
And then finally, there are the great corporate leaders and financial leaders who were also essential to the Industrial Revolution. J.P. Morgan, the great financier who helped put together some of the great combinations. Andrew Carnegie, who created the first great steel company. John D. Rockefeller, who created the first great oil trust. People were often called robber barons because they accumulated so much wealth and did it so ruthlessly, but people were also great builders.
Controversy surrounds these industrial giants, not only in relation to the great power and wealth they are amassing, but how they are doing it, and at what price.
Carnegie, Rockefeller, the great titans of industry are accumulating enormous fortunes and putting together industrial giants like U.S. Steel, which are capitalized at $1 billion in 1901, for example. So there's tremendous inequality of wealth, tremendous inequality of power in the United States.
Some businessmen attempt to assuage public criticism by supporting public projects.
The great industrialists, principally people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller Sr., in effect invented a philanthropic foundation, which is an utterly new American creation. What that means is it's an endowment to be expended indefinitely for a wide variety of different and not very carefully prescribed purposes, and that's really the key. The earliest kinds of endowments were for very specific purposes, and the problem with them was that the purpose would go away, but it was a perpetuity, so you were stuck with the endowment. And my favorite example of that, there was an endowment for the succor of weary wagon travelers on the way west in St. Louis. Well, what happened when there were no more wagons going west? So these were people who wanted to improve the quality of life for humankind, and that was the phrase they used. So they set up this very new form to give away money, to be managed by trustees who would be sensitive to new problems as they emerged.
The industrial workforce expands dramatically in the late 19th century as the demand for factory labor grows.
Well, the Industrial Revolution, of course, drew into it hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of American workers, immigrants and natives, who in earlier periods might have been farmers, but who were drawn into cities, drawn into towns, drawn into factories by the economic opportunities that were available to them.
The industrial city was a new kind of creature in terms of the kinds of jobs that were opening up, the kinds of industries that were growing, the massive numbers of relatively unskilled or in fact completely unskilled laborers that were required to make the engines of industry work.
Well, one of the reasons that so many newcomers from foreign lands were coming into the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century is that it coincided with a period of rapid industrialization and urbanization in this country.
But why do you go to New York instead of to Buenos Aires or to Rio de Janeiro or to Sydney or any other place in the New World? Well, because the wages are better in New York. Things are measurably more miserable in America than we would like them to be, but nevertheless measurably less miserable than elsewhere in the world. So around the turn of the century, some 55 million people get up from where they are and go somewhere else. About 33 million of them go to the United States. So the United States, uniquely among the industrializing nations, is an immigrant-receiving nation.
In part because of the skills they bring with them, in part because of their old world experience, in part because of the local economies of the cities that they arrive in largest numbers. Different ethnic groups tend to capture different industries, so that Jews and to a less extent Italians in the garment industry in New York are a really good example. Or holes in meatpacking in Chicago. It's the same kind of thing. Those groups don't exclusively fill every job in a certain industry, but overwhelmingly the industry itself becomes marked ethnically as kind of belonging to that group. And that's where managers and foremen look for replacements. Sometimes they would go out of their way to hire different groups just to keep the labor force segmented. The garment industry is a good example where they went way out of their way to hire Italians and then to seat people so that it was one Italian and then a Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrant and then another Italian, so that they cut down on communication. It was it was a kind of anti-union device. Keep the labor force more malleable by keeping them divided. But nonetheless, in industry after industry that you can name, each one has a kind of ethnic profile to it.